Stay on time. Wow, Ellen, that was like perfect timing. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to week 7 of Modern Management of the Older Adult Essential Foundations. This week, I think for most of the faculty has very quickly become one of our favorite weeks to talk about, but I also don't know if we say that about every week. But this is definitely one that is near and dear to all of our hearts because we talk about psychosocial considerations and where we can really narrow in on significance over sexiness. You know, we love a good heavy deadlift. We love watching our older adults see so much improvement in their physical function. They're being able to get off the ground. They're doing kettlebell swings, all of those really amazing things. But if our older adults are struggling with being lonely or being isolated, not having any support systems in place, not having a home, really quick story time. I was talking to a member at the gym. He's in his late 60s and he does some mission work with his church and was working with an older woman who he was going to bring her dog to the vet. And the story was that this mission group had helped to get her a home. So she had been previously homeless, had a lot of complexities going on, and they found her a home. And, you know, the long story short, other people had keys to her house. So people were coming into her home, but she didn't want to complain because she had been previously homeless. And her only companion was her dog. And these people had put methamphetamine on the floor and drugged her dog. So not only did they like invade her house, she didn't have anyone around. They drugged her dog. And so this mission group was like saved the dog. But it just like, they told me this story today and it just hit, you know, when you have a person whose home was homeless and now is in a home that isn't safe. And we come into these situations, we can give the most perfect PT program. We can have the most optimized OT program. We can come in with all of the supports from a rehab perspective. And they really aren't going to do, I don't want to say do anything because they will, but there are other things that are more important going on. And so I want to hear your stories. I want you to think of what was something or an example of something that you did for a patient that was non-exercise related. You know, I've had clients, for example, that we're trying to advocate for resources for things like adaptive equipment or compensatory equipment. So we're writing letters for grants. And yes, that's not getting an exercise that day, but if we can get a ramp in their house that is now more affordable for them, that is a huge, huge win. And so I want to hear some of your stories. Bring those into the chat. What is a way? Yeah, exactly. Kind of going into that adaptive equipment, right? Ellen's talking about a patient that she helped get a power wheelchair for to keep them from falling. And, you know, sometimes in PT, we're like, no, try and avoid the power wheelchair. But there's so many examples of when it's so needed. Yeah, referrals and applications for income-based housing, a church group that would build, oh, love that. Advocating for a VA patient to get a neurological consult. Yeah, advocating for patients all the time to get into acute rehab. The resources are slim and the beds are few, and trying to advocate for them is such a wonderful way that we can contribute. And so a word that I saw, advocate. Yeah, cooked breakfast. Amazing. Get them to cook with you. I love that. Our OTs in the room are like, yes, way to go. That is awesome. And so these are ways that we advocate for our clients, right? Where we probably have these stories that really pull on our heartstrings, where we are really thinking about these individual stories. And I definitely know that these are the stories that stick with me. There is identifying a venous ulcer after multiple doctors ignored it. I saved her life, she told me. Oh my goodness. That was an outpatient PT. And Sam said, I listened. That is so powerful. We think it's like we take it for granted, maybe like the impact we can have by being that active listener. Julie did a podcast lately where she said you can set yourself apart by making eye contact with the person that you are working with for several minutes, looking them in the eye, seeing them bearing their soul and listening to them. That is unbelievably powerful. And honestly, especially with the world of social media, I think it's becoming a skill that we are losing. That connection, that eye to eye, soul to soul, heart to heart connection that we have with another human. And it's definitely something that as a rehabilitation professional, I never take for granted in my job, even when sometimes I'm peopled out, because that connection is so important to who we are as humans. And it allows us, when we are really zooming out into the lens of the entire person, it really allows us to make that human to human connection. And while we speak in rehab very heavily in the physical domain of a person's health, we have to recognize that quality of life for an individual is multifactorial, and the physical domain is one of the domains of importance to them. We have to think about the emotional health, spiritual health, social health, and mental health of that individual. And if we are coming in with our gung-ho interventions and there is holes in every other dimension of a person's care, it's going to be a struggle for us to be able to really have that connection and really get to meaningful outcomes. And we talked a lot in the lectures this week around this social isolation piece. When we think about those with low psychosocial resources, we really have to think about it as another multiplier to our aging physiology and our outcomes. When we are talking about aging physiology as a whole, we often speak to the fact that chronic disease burden, physical inactivity, sedentary behavior, and adiposities all act as drivers or accelerators to aging physiology. We also see this come to light over and over and over again when we are looking in the psychosocial space. And so when we look at individuals with clinical geriatric syndromes, and we consider those with social isolation, we see that there's this multiplier effect, and that we have individuals with a 25% increase in all-cause mortality when individuals are socially isolated. And it's important for us, to recognize that social isolation is not the same thing as loneliness. When we think about the definition of social isolation, those are individuals who have few social contracts or contacts and relationships. We mean that the amount of face-to-face interaction or phone calls or number of interactions with individuals in general is few. People can spend multiple days without hearing from another human. People can come and see you on Sunday, but then you don't see anybody for 5 or 6 days. Loneliness is a sense of being alone, and it's not associated necessarily with few social contacts, but few meaningful social contacts. So this is where individuals have less than desired social relationships. And it's important to recognize that these aren't the same thing. They can be mutually seen or seen together, but they can also be distinct from each other. So just like physical inactivity and sedentary behavior are unique constructs where a person can be physically active but sedentary, or physically inactive and lack sedentary behavior, The same is true when we're thinking about social isolation and loneliness. So a person can be socially isolated, but not lonely because they are in a social construct that works for where they are and what they desire. One can be surrounded by people and be lonely. And with that being said, one can be lonely without being socially isolated. You can have all the people around you, but when you don't have the depth of that connection, it can still feel unbelievably lonely. That means that we need to have scales in order for us to recognize where or the impact that loneliness can have. And so this is the UCLA loneliness scale. And, we may be talking to some of you all in this room who are battling or struggling with some of these feelings, and know that you are not alone in some of these feelings. And so you ask 3 questions. How often do you feel that you lack companionship? How often do you feel left out? How often do you feel isolated from others? And then the anchors of that are hardly ever, some of the time, and often. And so each of those has a 1, 2, 3 scale. So if you mark hardly ever, that's a 1, some of the time that's a 2, often that's a 3. And then the sum of your responses to 1, 2, and 3 puts you on a spectrum from least lonely, which is 3, to most lonely, which is 9. And what we even try to do within our own community is try to help with that social connectedness piece. And that's where we have things like the MMOA community, where, we try and connect as humans at our live course, where after the course on day 1, we sweat together and then we go eat all sweaty together. And that's where we get to have, those meaningful conversations, those connections, those things that just, light your soul on fire and get you energized to go back into the clinic on Monday. And so, we talk about this. And so when it comes to our social connections, quality wins. I think about this as a person who is aging, where, when you're a kid and you're in high school and you're like, I just want to be the popular kid who everybody wants to be around. And then you get a little bit older and you're like, I want 2 or 3 super deep, really close friends that I can share all of my experiences with. And that makes my soul so happy, is to have those people that I know that I can lean on, and for a lot of individuals, that's their spouse, their close family, and then a couple of friends. And it just hits. So that quality over quantity is definitely where we see this coming in. And, the COVID pandemic really highlighted our need for social connectedness. And actually, funny enough, our older adults who were the most isolated did a lot better with the social isolation than some of us who are in that 20 to 50 age range, because we never experienced anything like that before. We had never had moments in our time where we were going through hardships in the same kind of way as the COVID pandemic. And, that was one example where, our home health physical therapists, I don't know if there's any on the call, or home health occupational therapists or PTAs, OTAs that are in home health, but you may have been the only person that during the pandemic, an individual saw. And so leaving homes was a bit more challenging because people were just craving that connection so bad. And, that is where some of our role is, to try and come in and, not to fill that person's social cup, but to try and figure out ways that we can patch up some of those other aspects of a person's being. And, some of our physical rehab may have some indirect impacts on other areas of quality of life. Example, if our client is super, really enjoys going to church on Sundays, and their church service has the kneeling, and we're able to allow them to kneel again to pray, then we can fill some of that spiritual cup, because they feel that they are participating in their religious ceremonies in a way that is meaningful to them. So that's where physical rehab can come in. And so we have lots of examples of being able to fill some of those psychosocial cups. But really what we're thinking about with respect to individuals who are lacking psychosocial resources is, how do we become a resource dealer and a matchmaker? And so when we are thinking about how to connect individuals with the right resources, we need to make sure that, one, our role is in screening. If we don't know that something is going on, or we haven't been able to screen for some of these issues, we're not going to know that the best thing that we can do is connect them with a resource. And then, I really felt this as an outpatient clinician. I've spent most of my career in outpatient physical therapy. It was really important to build my network. I was always jealous of some of our home health therapists who have other providers on staff that are just a text away, to be able to create some of these connections. But it's really important that we try to create this team. And it really is a quick Google search. I connected with the seniors associations, the Veterans Affairs office, some of the church groups. Like, I kind of had just like a running list at the clinic of different resources for individuals if something came up in my treatment plan. And it was just unbelievably helpful. And that's where social media can be a huge guide. Julie went on to her Facebook group or Facebook page and said, "Hey, I'm just looking for a fitness forward PCP, or I'm looking for, fitness forward clinicians that I can refer my older adults to." And she got individuals in her own network that were local to our area that were sharing resources and ideas. And that's where, we can hate on social media. And I do my fair share of hating on it, because there's a lot of love hate, but this is where it can be a huge plus, and allows for things for us to make connections. And Sam said, speaking of connectedness, if you want to shout out on the MMOA Physio Instagram, feel free to change your name on the Zoom call. Perfect. Wonderful. Connecting our Geri clinicians together. Took a while for that week to come up. Amazing. Instagram, falling into perspective DBT. You don't have any. The rest of us, we got 10. We knew what you meant. You're good. You're just rushing. Wonderful job. Sam had the kiddo with her. He did burpees too.
I got tackled 6 in, so I did some baby kettlebell swings at the end.
Love it. Connection. All right, so let's start talking about some of these assignments. So week 7, we want to get familiar with the floor. And it's funny, whenever I would talk to my clients about doing burpees, they looked at me like, "Excuse me, what?" But we really love conceptualizing it this way, because we kind of all know what burpees are. And we really do want to get our clients okay with being on the floor. It is a very powerful thing when you ask, when was the last time you purposefully, we should put purposefully in this question, got on the floor? And you're going to have some of your older adults who are comfortable. They have some musculoskeletal aches and injuries where they don't really love some of those transitions, but they're okay to get on and off the floor. But we're going to have some clients who can't remember the last time they were on the floor. I had my dad come down to North Carolina with me, and he has been battling low back pain. And, you know, I am finishing up a PhD in exercise and aging, and I'm a PT, and he asked me what to do about it. And I told him to do squats and deadlifts. And then he asked me again, and I said the same thing, but he, you know, went to another provider who popped him and put him on all these like passive modalities, and then didn't give him any exercise, and it didn't get better. So finally I got him down here, and we did squats and deadlifts, and he said he had the best night's sleep he'd had in 6 months. But I also asked him if he could get on and off the floor. And he was actually a little bit embarrassed about how hard it was for him to get up off the ground. And he was 64 at the time. So he is young, and he had to use furniture. He relied on it to get up, and he was really huffing and puffing. And so, you know, that was my education to him, being like, you know, we need to make sure that you don't lose these skills, because the timeline happens really fast, you know, and we don't really think about it. And this distance between when we, you know, stop voluntarily getting onto the ground and when we lose the capacity, we can somehow, or many times, just not recognize how much time has passed. You know, a year has passed and you're like, oh, well, I just don't get on and off the floor, but I definitely still could. Or after 5 years, you like, ooh, I wonder if I can still do that. It's been a really long time since I was doing any type of floor work. 10 years goes by and you're like, well, I used to be able to do that. Like, whew, Jeff, I'm 77 years old. You can't be asking me to do that anymore. Do you know how old I am? And then, you know, 15 years comes by, this fear of falling is just so high, and the floor becomes lava. Like, will not have lots of fear about what would happen if you hit the floor. Yeah. The seeds of doubt grows into trees of doubt that are sometimes unwavering. So, Sam said, I had a patient tell me, you don't gradually get old. You just wake up one day and suddenly realize what you can't do and what is so much harder. And, you know, like some of those things, they gradually creep in, and then they hit this critical threshold. And you're right. You don't recognize that you've lost certain things. I find the same thing with many of my clients when I ask them if they can jump, and they didn't realize that they lost the capacity to get off the ground, like that, any type of acceleration to get off the floor. It's powerful. All right. So we are going to go through a couple of different examples. I want you to think about the way that this student went through this exercise, and tell me all of the things that you're going to really need in order to be able to do this successfully. Right. So what are you going to need in order to go supine to sit and standing up from there? Think muscle strength, think joints. Yeah, Cassie said core strength. Absolutely. They're going into a big sit up, that hip range of motion to get up and underneath, the flexibility in the lower body for sure. Yep. Yep. Definitely full hip knee flexion, fair to good lower extremity strength. Absolutely. Right. Getting into that lunge position and being able to get up. Yeah, that's quite a lot. And, you know, we have to think about that when we're prioritizing things in our course of care, right? We tend to, in physical therapy, heavily leverage the lower body, and we can't. We have to make sure that we are prioritizing overall global strength in a lot of different ways. When we think about floor transfers, sometimes momentum is our friend, and leveraging this head-hip relationship where we can use that movement of the head and that opposing direction of the hips to really facilitate our transfers with our patients can be extremely helpful. Our neuro colleagues do this all of the time. And we need to make sure we leverage it as much as we can in our geriatric practice. You're setting it up. Here we go. Phew. Head comes down, hips travel back. Successful transfer. Wonderful. Whenever we are doing floor transfers, I always say, I'm like, I don't need this to look pretty. I need this to be effective, right? Kind of going in that significance over sexiness. The significant part here is that we successfully get you into a chair when you were on the floor. Or if you were to get on the floor, and it's probably not ideal, that we can figure out a way, pretty or not, that we can get you back into that recliner so that we don't need to call 911. And so one way that we can do that is to try and like beach ourselves up. And you're going to see this example. So she's kind of leaning her back and kind of falling backwards and just pushing through her feet to get herself up into a seated position. And then also does a really wonderful job of leveraging tools in order to close that distance if that distance was too high, by making kind of this stepping gradual movement up into the plinth. So in this example, what's needed here? What are you seeing a lot of, especially in that second example? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, beautiful. So everyone's got it. So when you are trying to come from behind, what's nice about the beaching of yourself, where you're kind of anchoring your upper back against the plinth and pushing through your legs, is that you can kind of work around any upper extremity or tricep limitation. Because if you are trying to come back behind you, you have to have a pretty good amount of tricep extension. You have to be able to weight bear through your upper extremity in that extended position. And you have to have a certain amount of tricep strength and upper extremity strength in order for us to be able to complete that movement. So tricep dips should be a staple in many, if not all, of our programs. But as we are working on those dips to try and get that strength, having that anchoring of the upper back and trying to shimmy and shift backwards as much as we can to offload the upper body and really try and get our hips as close to we can to the surface we're trying to sit to is going to be a powerful way to work around some of those limitations in shoulder extension or weakness in the upper extremity tricep in particular, to try and make that transfer successful. All right. In the resources section on the website, we have a video from an occupational therapist called Floor Transfers MacGyver Style. And I really encourage you to take a look through it. She goes through a wonderful array of examples of how to get up and off the ground. But this was one hack that legitimately, the first time I saw it, it blew my mind. So she is kind of shimmying her hips back and forth to gradually lift her hips up as much as she can in order for her to get to the couch. So here is an example. This is one way for us to use all of our old PT/OT textbooks that I don't think I have taken a look at in many, many years. I don't even remember the last time I took a look at some of those textbooks, but I still have them. My husband always tries to get rid of them, and I somehow think that I need them, but I do not. Right. And then you can figure out how many books that you need or what height you need. Yeah. We can build a fort. My kids would love that. To be able to scooch back to the chair. So a really nice example of a way for us to lift the floor up by using things that are around us. And I think going through that checklist when you are thinking about going through this with your patient is so helpful. Whether that is taking a moment to scan around the room, because ideally, if we are thinking about floor transfers with respect to falls recovery, we want to be in the situation in the room where individuals are having falls so that we can troubleshoot or problem solve ways for them to get up should that situation arise again. That's number one, if we're at home health. If we are an outpatient and we're working with a person and we think that prioritizing floor transfers is a really important part of their program, and we're going to bias towards that being really important way more often than it's not important, then going through examples like this where you are thinking, okay, I have Susan with me. I know that her left shoulder is really stiff and sore. So she's probably not going to be able to push off of it as much. And her knee replacement is doing really well, but she's kind of not wanting to put full weight on it. How can I work around some of those restrictions? And then in your staff room for a minute or two, go through that scenario and think about the way that you would go through, similar to that floor transfer challenge where you're removing limbs, and try and figure out a way to go and do those floor transfers given the restrictions that your client has. And that may think, okay, these are the muscle groups that I'm actually working really hard to leverage and get into a successful seated position from being on the floor. Maybe I need to prioritize strengthening here, here, and here a little bit more. Or we're going to problem solve ways so that when we walk into that treatment session, we feel significantly more confident about the way that this floor transfer is going to go than when we get them on the floor and all of a sudden something doesn't go the way we expect it to. And we're having this, oh shit moment where we don't know if we can get them out. That's not what we want. So we want to consider the location. So when we think about the location, this is a really good example of a person who is mimicking a fall that may happen in the bathroom. We know that lots of falls happen in the bathroom. Dogs can sometimes get in the way. Sometimes they're a help. Sometimes they're a hindrance. My dogs would 100% be a hindrance. They would not be helping me at all. They'd be getting in my face. And you know, you probably have a lot of stories of the dog being the cause of the fall, whether it's being tripping over an animal or being pushed by on a walk with an animal who sees a squirrel or whatever it might be. Yeah, you're on the floor. Perfect. Time to kiss your face. So you can see here that she's also kind of coming back. I got distracted by the animals. So as she's coming around, she's using the toilet and being able to kind of explain through how to push off. Oh no. And that can allow you to kind of get up into standing. Jeff said I saw a client with a distal radial fracture from poor leash behavior. Oh no. And, you know, another location, speaking of poor leash behavior, where falls might happen is outside. And so we have uneven ground. We have, you know, all these different scenarios where if individuals are community ambulators or limited community ambulators and they're trying to walk their dog and something happens, we may think about problem solving through being on the grass. I feel like there's like a little drama with that follow a second. Huh. Yeah, falling during yard work for sure. Gardening, trying to carry hoses, getting caught in the hose. So really kind of wonderful examples of ways for us to try and simulate the situations at which we fall. Because we talked in the falls prevention lecture that, you know, if we are not emulating to the best of our ability the situations and circumstances at which a person falls, then we can't realistically think that we're going to positively contribute to the falls risk reduction. So this kind of really hammers in some of those points. All right. Let me know if you have any other questions about that. So we had a couple of questions in the student doc. So I want to make sure that we go through those. So Heather asked, any general footwear recommendations? I have a few patients who wear those damn Merrill slides and I'm trying to get them out of them. So I thought this might be a good time to ask. Thanks. So I'll kind of give my bias and then I'll open it up to some of the faculty. When I think about the choice of shoe wear that my clients are using, so much like those slides are because they're working around mobility restrictions, and being able to get into and out of shoe wear is sometimes one of the biggest challenges, and probably one of the biggest, other than financial resources, one of the biggest parts of the decision of what shoe wear individuals are going to be wearing. If I have a client who is wearing those Merrill slides, I'm probably just going to try and get them out of their shoes in general. As long as the floor isn't slippy, then getting them into bare feet might be better than having them with any shoe wear. If we are looking for recommendations for different shoes, what I tend to look for is what the amount of cushiness in the heels are. I'm not a shoe expert at all. Dustin's totally a shoe guy. But if they have big padded shoes, then that might help us for things like sit to stands, but for things like deadlifts, it may push us into a more squatty pattern or put them into their toes a little bit earlier than we would like them to be when they're coming forward, when they're lifting weights. So I don't have any specific suggestions. I don't know if any of the other faculty wants to jump in on that, but yeah, someone said recommending Crocs. Oh, there's the Merrill shoes. Jeff, are you as much of a shoe guy? I feel like
I wouldn't profess to be as good at shoes as Dustin. He actually worked at a shoe store for a while. But two things that I see is like are people with balance deficits, that huge stack height where it's like they've got on a pair of Hokas and like there's an inch and a half of cushion. It's like walking around on a balance pad. So if they've got any deficits in their sensory input in their feet and they're struggling with their balance, those things make it a lot harder to like balance in real life. But then also keeping in mind, like if they have significant ankle deficits, you're working on squatting, like Christina already pointed out, what you're looking for is heel to toe drop. That heel to toe drop is something you can look up on the shoe wear and making sure if they need that accommodation, it's there. But then also keeping in mind that stack height can make it a lot more challenging to balance. And to Christina's point, getting people barefoot, if they've got protective sensation and you're in a safe environment, is awesome for increasing sensory input, because you're reducing those layers of contact and increasing sensory input and acuity of that input. So I usually encourage people that need that accommodation to use it, but not throw everyone in like a pair of Hokas with a huge stack height, because they may not need that and may make their balance performance worse. So heel to toe drop if you need it, support if you need it, and as little as possible otherwise is usually my bias.
so. A couple of comments. Helen said, I recommend Crocs for shower shoes and Kizix. I don't know if I pronounced that right. This is really showing how much of a not shoey I am. And then Merrills aren't bad in general, but should have those with backs. This question is so expansive. 100%. We could go in a million different directions. Brittany said, I don't know about shoes specifically, but if laces are an issue, they make elastic laces that don't have to be tied. So just having them to slide feet in made a difference for some of my peeps with neural conditions in the past. Perfect. Anyone else have anything to add to that? No.
You know that Harry Potter potion where they thought that they were going to be lucky for the day, but they actually just tricked them into thinking that they were lucky? I think some patients have that same theory with shoes. They're like, oh no, my balance is great in these shoes. My feet don't hurt in these shoes. And they'll believe what they like the most. And I think that that might be kind of a component too that's underrated. You can ask a patient, which shoes do you feel like your balance is best in? And then let them make that decision.
Kind of spinning off that, I think this is a good one to like ease into. Like, you know, we're not going to change someone's house by taking all their rugs away because that rug has a lot of meaning to them. I think shoes might be the same way. They might not be as meaningful from a like sentimental point, but they're still like, these are the shoes I wear. So it's like, hey, 2 days a week, can you wear a different type of shoe? Or when you're tired, can you wear a different type of shoe? Or, you know, kind of approach it that way if the shoes are causing them issues. So like when they know they've had a longer day, like halfway through the day, switch to a more sturdy shoe or something like that might be a good approach.
I must admit, Ellen, when you went Harry Potter on, I was like, I don't know where she's going with this. I loved the tie back, but I must like the first set, I was like, I don't know where she's going. But
keeping you on your toes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I love it. Felix Felicia, there you go. All right. So Michelle asks, I don't quite grasp how breaking down the burpee for the most limited patient is beneficial for the patient if 1, you are doing the majority of the work, and 2, it's only 1 rep because the amount of work to do that is likely exhausting for the patient. Is this where you would be modifying the depth for them to be able to do a few repetitions? The cost benefit doesn't seem worth it, where you may get them to the floor and then they have nothing left in the tank to get back up. So I really love this question. And I think that there's a couple things that we want to unpack with it. One is, what is the person's capacity for recovery and where are they with respect to their setting? For example, for some individuals in inpatient rehab, yes, it may be absolutely exhausting to do that 1 repetition, but that may be a really important consideration for if they can come back, they can go home versus another institutionalized setting, right? They may be early in their rehab process. They may be doing a rehabilitation for a stroke and their recovery is still going to continue, but we want to make sure that they're able to hit certain things, and getting up and off the floor might be one of them. So that's one consideration, is kind of where is our setting and what do we think their capacity for recovery is. The second thing is, if you are doing the majority of the work and maybe at least in the short term, their capacity to recover may not be in this space that we think that they're going to be able to be getting up and off the floor easily, then when we are doing the majority of the work or the floor transfer is quite intensive, this is where we may be thinking about doing the caregiver training. So if this is an individual who is going to have a really hard time getting off the floor independently, or there's a ton of work involved with getting them up and off the floor, but they are a frequent flyer, unfortunately, for our firemen that are coming in, firewomen that are coming in to help get them off the ground, then giving the caregiver supports of ways to help going into a situation, going into a session, thinking about, yes, we may only do 1 rep, but it is for the caregiver's peace of mind, if this was to happen, is definitely a viable option. It is also a wonderful option to break it down into steps and start working on, just like you said, maybe modified range of motion, or, you know, for some individuals, bed mobility is a huge part of the floor transfer capacity. And that doesn't require actually getting them on the ground, but gets them comfortable with rolling, with going from sideline to sitting, with going from being on their belly to being into quadruped. All of those skills are really important parts of breaking down this task in order for when we start getting them up and off the ground and putting all of those components together, that they feel confident and ready to be able to do that. And so we can absolutely break it down into its composite points and try and build capacity within them so that when we pull them together, it may be beneficial and smoother for all parties involved. And so we can kind of take that in a variety of different directions. I don't know if there's a combination. Yeah. Julie, did you want to expand on your point?
Yeah, so when I was working in acute care, I was prioritizing getting people down on the floor in any way possible. Obviously, these people are super, super acutely ill many times. It was not because I wanted to do that for fitness. It was just for a falls preparedness standpoint. Most of these folks are going to be discharged home, even when they probably need a subsequent level of care. And so the burpee, AKA, is just floor recovery for them. It's probably the most helpful thing that I could do for them at that time. Definitely not something like if I was creating a remom or something for them, probably wouldn't be using that as part of their exercise session. But so yeah, it's just important to know your why for that.
Yeah. Ellen, did you want to expand on that last point?
Yeah. So I had a patient who came in and she's wickedly over medicated for anti-seizure medications, has dementia. She's like falling asleep half the time during my sessions. And I'm like, okay, let's get her down on the ground. That feels like a great idea. For whatever reason, she had like a month-long functional decline after that session. She was sick. There were a lot of unrelated factors, but her husband associated her functional decline with me in my treatment session. And so am I necessarily going to argue with him and be like, no, we really need to do floor transfers? No, I'm just going to take the L on that one and maybe have her practice bed mobility instead. And I've got bigger fish to fry, but sometimes you just got to take the L and say, well, that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I think you and I are in the same camp. We're kind of in that big cheerleaders headspace. And so you always like, no, we could definitely do it. And sometimes you just have to, yeah, take the L. That's a perfect way of saying
Yep.
it. Yeah. Julie, we got to be okay with taking the L. All right. So William asked, when screening is positive for cognitive impairment or emotional health, who do you typically refer to? Speech language, back to primary care, to a neurologist? And do you have any tips for communicating your concerns in a respectful yet effective way to the appropriate medical provider? When it comes to cognition or emotional health, the answer can be all of the above. So we can be referring back to primary care. We can be referring, it kind of depends on what the referral network needs to look like. So if they don't have a neurologist, for example, then we may have to refer to primary care and maybe suggest a referral to a neurologist, depending on what that looks like. And we can definitely refer to our speech language colleagues. I'm going to pull this conversation to some of our people on faculty that are in kind of home health settings, because I think they're getting into these situations a lot more than I did in outpatient. So I don't know if, I know Anushka's on here now. Where is she? She came at the perfect time.
Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. So I am in outpatient neuro. So I have access to a speech language pathologist on site. So if I do see that we have cognitive changes, we do refer them to our speech language pathologist, as well as indicate that in the initial eval or the progress note. And then in those notes, we'll say, this is what we saw. Typically from PT standpoint, I'm looking at dual test cost. So I explain what I saw and why I'm referring them to speech language pathology. And then with that, typically plan of cares are signed and we have them back. That's perfectly fine. If we're looking for something I will refer out for a lot of the time is neuropsych, and that we give the patient the resources. We have pretty good communication with a neuropsychologist at one of our local neurologists. So we'll give them that information and then refer them there, as well as let the primary care, whoever the referring provider is, that we sent them that referral. And we always try to, either if it's anything big, especially if like cognitive changes are happening rapidly, we will reach out to their neurologist or whoever their referring provider is. So definitely like connecting with the community is important. Making sure you know where those resources are is great. And then just having good communication. Like we typically talk to neurologists or referring providers more frequently than I'd say some people do, but that's just because we're seeing a little bit more changes and we're seeing them more frequently. So, yeah.
Love it. Anyone else have anything to add to that? Beautiful. When it comes to any tips for communicating your concerns in a respectful way, when it comes to clinician, I think, which I think is where this question was coming from, I always kind of come in with the idea that our clinicians that we are referring back to do not know that this is going on, and we are trying to give them that information. So I don't usually consider it as like we're stepping on toes, or that I would have any concerns. I would just say, I was coming in for home health. I did a screen, something came up, and I wanted to refer back to see if this is something that you think would require more evaluation, or they expressed concerns to me about this. I wanted to make sure that we closed the communication loop so that we are all on the same page. I think when we go into those interactions saying, we are a healthcare team, we are a multidisciplinary team where all of us and all of our scopes of practice are or should be focused on what is best for the patient, then I don't really get too concerned with respect to the way that I'm communicating, because I don't consider myself to be stepping on toes. I don't know if anyone's had a not so positive interaction. Like, I've never had a medical provider, if I'm saying, hey, there's like this flagged, have you had one, Helen? I just wanted to make you aware. Like, I've never had a provider that came back to me and was like, you shouldn't have done that.
Yeah. So you guys are just gonna all be like, man, who gave her a job? She's really not doing her best stuff these days. So I have to be honest, this is another L moment where I really kerplopped on my face. So I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm going to do the mocha, and I'm just going to really test this guy's ability to drive. And there's some pretty cool apps and resources. There's the Safe Drive app. If you look on the screen on your iPhone, it looks kind of like this. It's a decision-making tree for things like driving, that Safe Drive app. And I had a fellow who's like, I want to get back to driving. And I'm like, let's do a mocha. And he bombed it. And it was like, no bueno. Long story short, the patient was mad at me. So with great power comes great responsibility. If you're going to do some of this stuff and make these recommendations back to the patient, or back to the healthcare provider, make sure that you're recognizing how much power this is going to wield to impact their life, and be ready to kind of combat somebody being mad at you that you made a recommendation that they not drive at all anymore. Side note, that app does make a really good point to say not drive right now until we work on something. So that app isn't focused on keeping older people from driving ever again. It's saying, okay, maybe not right now, or until we focus on some things. So that app is really cool. If you wanted to check it out, I can put a link in the chat.
So the last question is, how do you incorporate your 1 rep max strength assessments into your goal writing? Do you write a strength goal specifically for 1 rep max? What would an example of that look like? So I am very rarely doing estimated 1 rep maxes day 1 on initial eval. When I think about the strength goal that I'm writing, I am more trying to put a weight or number on the activity or task that my client has identified that is meaningful to them. And then subsequently, if we are doing 1 rep max evaluations, then we can kind of figure out how close is the task that they are doing to their 1 rep max. And then how can I build that capacity as much as possible to make that task be a much lower percentage of their 1 rep max by building their physical capacity. So here's what I mean by that. So for example, if I have a client who their goal is to lift up a laundry basket full of clothes, we say, client's goal is to be able to do 2 loads of laundry basket, estimated weight about 15 pounds within 2 weeks without needing for assistance or without using their walker, or whatever their specific goal is going to be. The next day, we may come in and try and figure out what their estimated 1 rep max for their deadlift is by going up in weights until they tell me that they can't, or finding a relatively heavy weight and asking them to do an AMRAP set. So estimated 1 rep max calculation versus AMRAP sets, and looking at that based on estimated 1 rep max tables, the 2 ways that we went through in week 5. So if we're saying that the laundry basket is 15 pounds, and then we find out that their max is 20 pounds, then we know that task of picking up a laundry basket, they are currently working at 75% of their capacity. So we roughly know that is a task that they can complete for about 8 repetitions, 8 to 10, and that's going to be their max. So that is kind of where we bring in the 1 rep max to their goal. So we don't want to get in the weeds of putting a specific kind of PT goal on it where we want to increase their deadlift from 15 pounds to 30 pounds. We want to always frame that goal writing in response to the meaningful things that our clients have expressed to us. And then we use their estimated 1 rep max to see how close are they, or what is their capacity from a 1 rep max living perspective? And then what can we do to boost that max capacity up so that the relative effort that they are using in their day-to-day task is as little as possible, so that it's as repeatable and as they can get as confident as possible with those movements. Does that make sense? Anything else, any of the other faculty wanted to add into that? No. Cool. All right. 8:58. Next week, last week, we are going to be talking about all things health promotion. We're going to talk about the buckets of health promotion: primary, secondary, tertiary. Then we want to give a framework for having lifestyle related conversations. I know sometimes it can be tough when we're in the older adult space where there is a lot of chronic disease burden already going on, but we know that there's a lot of benefit that can happen from these conversations, and that the more healthcare providers speaking the same language, the more likely we are to see behavior change. As a reminder, all of our assignments and our final exam must be submitted by Sunday at 8:00 EST. That is vital for you getting your CEUs. Please, if you for whatever reason do not think that you're going to get your CEUs in, communicate with us sooner rather than later. We need to know if there is anything going on that is going to prevent you from going through. We go through different circumstances around late assignments on a case-by-case basis, but know that this Sunday at 8:00 is the deadline for all things midterm exam, final exam, assignments 1 through 8. All right. It's 9:00. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us this Wednesday. Last week is next week, and we can't wait to hang out with you guys again next Wednesday. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll talk again soon.